Hello, everybody. I am so excited to see you here today. This is one of my favorite exhibitions that we're going to be spotlighting. But before we get started, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about money. Textile Talks is put on by these 5 organizations, but there are a lot of costs that are involved. We need to pay for the Zoom platform. We need to pay for the connectivity methods to send you reminders. We need to pay our presenters. We need to pay for marketing to get the word out. And we need to pay for the staff that make it all happen. So as you've just seen, we have a lot of very generous corporate sponsors, but like everything else, costs are going up, and we are estimating that the next 12 months of Textile Talks are going to cost more than $42,000. So we would like to ask for your help, and at the bottom of your screen, you can see at www.SAQA.com/TT support, Textile Talk support, we would like to ask you to consider making a donation to help offset the costs of these wonderful programs. We also would like to invite you to consider joining our organization, Studio Art Quilt Associates, SAQA. Right now, we have a special offer for Textile Talk viewers that if you use the discount code TALKS, you can get $20 off of a new membership and be part of all of the special programming that we provide just for SAQA members, webinars, seminars, conferences, the opportunity to submit your art to one of our traveling exhibitions like gastronomy. Please go to SAQA.com/join, read about membership, and use the discount code TALKS to get $20 off. Finally, we are starting to plan our next conference, which will be in Toronto in 2023. And we are looking for people who would be interested in doing a presentation or a workshop or a panel. And we would love to hear from you if you have an interesting proposal at www.SAQA.com/calls, proposals, or to nominate somebody else that you know who you think would be a great presenter. The deadline is June 15th. All righty. Now, we are going to talk about the exhibition that you saw the slideshow at the beginning, and we'll be showing that slideshow again at the very end if you hang in there. Gastronomy is defined by the dictionary as the science of good eating. And that's really a great definition. And these 3 artists that are going to be presenting today have created art that really celebrates that good eating that gastronomy is all about. As you watch their presentations, if you have questions, please go ahead and post them in either the chat or the Q&A. I'll be watching what's posted, and then we'll ask our 3 artists to answer your questions. The one exception to that is our first artist, Lisa Walton. Lisa lives in Sydney, Australia, so it's the middle of the night for her. So she pre-recorded her presentation, but please go ahead and post your questions to her, and we will be saving the chat and saving the Q&A, and we'll send her your questions so that she can answer them. So now I'd like to have Lisa tell you about her piece in the traveling exhibition Gastronomy.
Hi, I'm Lisa Walton, and I'd like to talk to you about my quilt called Blue Pots, which has been accepted into the SAQA Gastronomy exhibition. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and I've been a textile artist for over 30 years. and it is absolutely my passion. I work with textiles every day, and I'm always at my happiest when I'm in my studio. One of the benefits of my life as a textile artist and as a former chef is the availability to do textile and food tours. And one of my favorite countries in the world is Japan. There is just so much inspiration, and I just love it. Every time I go, I take thousands and thousands of photos. You can never take too many pictures. I think at last count, I have about 16,000 photos on my camera, and every one of them is a treasure and potential inspiration for another quilt. On one of my tours, I was fortunate enough to go to the Edo Tokyo Open Air Architectural Museum. It's a museum that's had buildings donated to it, and then they put them up again in this beautiful park. This time I was there in winter, so sometimes we get snow, sometimes we get spring flowers, but any time it's just beautiful. My favorite area is the downtown area, where they have a whole street of buildings that have a stationery store, grocery store, and in that time there were specialists. So there was a soy sauce store, a sake brewery, a tailor's workshop, which was beautiful, had some lovely, beautiful kimonos hanging in it. Those cans are actually whale meat, which I don't think I would really like to try. My favorite store was the kitchen store, which had an incredible collection of pots and pans and things that the normal Japanese housewife would have purchased and treasured, unlike today's throwaway society. And then in a corner, I saw these blue pots. I think they must have been a bit extravagant because they had pride of place. And I just love the way the light reflected off the windows. So I decided that I needed to take some more photos. And this is the photo that I used as the inspiration for my quilt. So when I got home, I started playing around with different photo apps. Some of them I could not work out how to turn into a quilt, and some of them were just fun. This one was the closest I got to a way that I thought I could translate into a quilt. This was a few years ago, and I hadn't really perfected my style. So this was one of my earliest quilts that I did in this technique. I dyed a whole pile of fabrics. I've been a textile dyer for many years, and so I just did a gradation going from dark blue through to nearly white. I think there were about 8 to 10 different colours in my range. I numbered them all separately, and I fused them with Misty Fuse. And if you don't know about Misty Fuse, it's a wonderful, soft, fusible web that you can add to your fabrics. You just iron it on the back of your fabrics, and then they stick beautifully when you iron them to other fabrics. And because it's such a soft product, you can do multiple layers, and it's definitely my fusible of choice. I worked out how to print out my image onto normal paper on my printer. I tiled it, and then I traced around each of those different value shades, and I numbered them from 1 to 8 or 9, however many fabrics I had decided on. Then I traced each shape and then cut them out separately, and you have to work out which ones you want to layer upon each one, because you don't really want to have 6 or 8 layers of fabric. So it's quite an interesting jigsaw exercise to do, but I really enjoy doing that. I made each pot separately, and you can see here that the different shapes don't look like much, but you just keep adding them, and eventually you get to the shape that you want. So here are the pots being built. I call them buildings separately. And then I had to decide on a background. Now I decided on a really dark blue background, and it was too dark. When I put all the pots on it, it was too dark. So I needed to do something about it. So I found a patch of my mother's old recipe books, and I love using Thermofax screens. So I burnt some screens using images of these old recipe books with her handwritten recipes. Remember the days we used to write our own recipes into books and cut out things from magazines and newspapers? Now we just go to Google and say, I have 1 eggplant and 1 bit of beef. What do I do with it? And Google will tell us what to do. But these were treasured things that I have from my mother. So I printed out a dark blue piece of fabric, and then I laid the pots on it. So you can see there, you can see the writing, and then you can see how I've used it in the background. When I came to the quilting, I outlined each of the different shapes that I had put on, and I outlined them roughly with the quilting a couple of times. I didn't want it to be perfect. I wanted it to look drawn. And then when I did the writing, I actually replicated some of that writing with my quilting as well. And this is the finished quilt. It's called Blue Pots, and it's part of the SAQA Studio Art Quilt Associates web exhibition, and it'll be traveling around the world for a few years, and I hope some of you get to see it. This was my attempt at a self-portrait. I think it worked out quite well because my mother even recognized me from it. And so you can use this technique for replicating any photo, really. It's just a matter of playing around in computer software. Over the last few years, I've developed this further and turned it into a class, which I call Photo to Quilt. This is one of my students' work where she's transferred that image of that beautiful flower, I think it's a poppy, and turned it into a textile. I've currently been working in a group that's called Cloth in Common, and we're a group of 12 international artists, and for this rotation we're working on structures. So I decided to use this technique, my photo to quilt technique, to create images based on Gaudi architecture. This is the Sagrada Familia, and this is an internal view. It's the skeleton, and you can see that there are lots and lots of shapes. And then I have an overlay, which is a new technique that I've developed, and I've stuck down all those little pieces. They're all fused with Misty as well. This one is the Casa Batlló, and it's the front facade of Casa Batlló, and using the same technique. So all the blues were hand-dyed fabrics, and then I overlaid it with the little tiny shapes. And this third one here is called Descent, and it's looking down into a spiral staircase, and it's really just the most amazing building in the world, if it ever gets finished. During the COVID times, I've also been very busy doing videos on YouTube, and I call them artist stories, and there's lots and lots of quilt stories and jewelry stories. I also put some of my textile techniques and other interesting videos, so I hope you'll get a chance to have a look at that. I have a range of on-demand classes and downloads available, and I'm on the Podia platform, and this is the website where you would go and find my classes. And just to use technology, because we're all so used to using QR codes, haven't we, to check in everywhere during COVID, if you point your camera at this, you'll get all my links. So I'd like to thank you so much for watching, and thank you to SAQA for the opportunity to share my work. Bye for now.
Thank you, Lisa. Now we're going to be hearing from Jeannie Palmer Moore about her piece that's traveling in gastronomy.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Moore, and I live in Kerrville, Texas. And thank you, Martha, for inviting me to share some of my techniques from how I design my quilts. Limoncello is my one for gastronomy. And a little bit about myself, I can't remember when I wasn't creating something, or usually quite messy, using my hands in paint, paper, or fabric. I was the girl who was reprimanded for drawing horses in the margin of the school papers. To keep me busy, my parents enrolled me in Saturday art classes in Pasadena, California. And I did go on and receive my graphic design and illustration degree and worked while my husband was starting his business. And okay, so then after the kids were born, I took some adult ed watercolor classes. And I also experimented with acrylics and printmaking papers. I painted on canvas, so fabric was the most logical thing to experiment with. I painted on canvas, and I picked up a quilting arts magazine, and I loved what artists were doing with fabric. That was the perfect avenue for me in 2008 to write articles creating new techniques with paint, dye, paper, and fabric for the magazine. Around that time, I joined SAQA, and in 2012, my tomatoes was chosen to travel with the seasonal palette exhibition. And in 2015, more of my tomatoes toured in the Food for Thought exhibition. So the gastronomy exhibit was a perfect fit for me. My inspiration for my paintings of limoncello come from my photos, which I still use to this day for my quilts. Limoncello was a still life arrangement, which I arranged and photographed. And the painting that was transferred to the limoncello quilt is painted with acrylics on Yupo. It's a very slippery printmaking paper. I especially like to create all of my fabric from my quilts. And for limoncello, I printed some Italian maps onto silk and also men's silk tie transfers. It's a fun way to create fabric, especially since you can never predict what the silk tie will transfer. I use the painting I've transferred as a guide, often changing or adding to the quilt. I follow the same principles as with watercolor painting. I was taught to paint the background at the same time as your subject matter to give it unity. My sketchbook pages, back to my sketchbook pages for my travels, are another inspiration for my quilts. It's a great way to get your creative juices flowing by flipping through your sketchbooks. I also had pages from my sketchbooks printed on fabric and used bits and pieces on some of my quilts. Italian Window is another transfer from 2 watercolor paintings and photos from my travels. Composition and design are foremost important to me for an art quilt, but I love to sneak in little details like some newspaper transfer on the tomatoes. Also, some of my hand-dyed botanical fabrics. The bold stripes on the next slide are actual men's silk tie transfer. And there's the close-up of my tomatoes. And after adhering the fabrics with Misty Fuse, I free motion quilt, always following the contours and shapes. And if it's an animal, I follow the direction of how the fur will lay, basically the thread painting. On the next slide of Mr. Macduff, I went back to my painting roots. And from a photograph, I drew with a lead pencil, Mr. Macduff, on untreated canvas, and then I free motion stitched my drawing. I designed my own thermofax screens and screen on the canvas in certain areas with acrylic white paint. I use circles and words in a way that just gives the idea of the curly wool. I then use Inktense pencils by Derwent and a wet brush for the colors. For my 3 ladies, they were also transferred from one of my watercolor paintings on Yupo paper. And this shot was taken in the assembly stage. The newsprint was transferred onto organza with gel medium, and the thermofax screens were used for the branches. Lace was added from a cloth napkin, all Misty Fused before free motion quilted. Polar Bear, the next one, is also in progress, and that's a good example of using a variety of printed fabrics of different colors to achieve the movement of water and fur in a painterly style. I'm not trying to make it look like a photograph, but instead using a variety of colors, lines, and textures, letting the fabric paint the picture. I hope people look closely at my quilts because you never know what details you will see in them. So I love texture and stitching and dyeing my own botanical fabrics for my quilts. And I'm constantly reinventing my processes of working with fabric. So I hope you enjoy the whole show of gastronomy. Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce Diana Fox.
Hi. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you so much to SAQA for having me on the program. I'm really excited to be here. Just a little bit about my background to start. I have a degree in organizational development from Regis University in Denver, and I worked in a government setting as a human resource professional for my paid career. I started quilting in a traditional format when I had toddlers at home, which was a long time ago because my kids are now in their early 40s, and transitioned to art quilts in around 2007, and I've never looked back. Next is a short video from a recent open house in Paducah, Kentucky, where I had a 2-week artist residency. I think it's helpful to see the artwork hanging just as an introduction. So this is the entryway into the studio. And the artwork there in the corner is not part of this series, nor is it my artwork. So this is Big Blue, which is just finished. This is Les Fleurs. This is Who Broke the Yoke, and Trees, Tree Rings. Next. So how this all started was, I belong to an invitational group of fiber artists living in the 4 states region known in the United States as the Four Corners. We have a quarterly theme as a prompt, and one of the themes in 2020 was the wisdom of trees. Oftentimes at the beginning of a project, I will do a little writing exercise about the theme in order to kind of come up with prompts and ideas as jumping off points. And so that's what I did with this project. And I asked the question, essentially, how are trees wise? And I came up with all of the climate and atmospheric conditions that occurred during the life of the tree are displayed in the rings. The branches connect the earth and sky and provide oxygen, food, and shelter. We have a very large wood pile on our property, which is used to partially heat our home in the winter. And so I went out and actually sat in the wood pile and sat with the wood and really studied it. I did a rubbing technique called frottage, which is a layer of fabric on the actual object and rubbing with a ink pencil. And so that helped me to kind of gain a different connection with the logs. I then asked, what if, like the trees in the forest, each trunk stood on its own, yet touched its neighbors? Could I create a piece of individual sort of roundish pieces with no background? So this is how the first piece in what I now call the Gifts from the Universe series was conceived. I formulated each tree ring individually from recycled materials, scraps, a burlap bag, frotaged fabric, and recycled clothing. I cut the fabrics into circles and raw edge appliqued them down onto a background piece, layered with a piece of heavy duty stabilizer, eco felt for the batting because it's just a little stiffer, and then of course a backing. I then satin stitched around each of the edges as a finish. Finally, the pieces were stitched together. In essence, each piece of or rounds is like a little quilt in and of itself. This piece was juried into SAQA Sustainability and went on its way today. Next. This piece is called Sand Dollars. To create this piece, I tied squares of cotton fabric and then dyed each individually using Procyon MX dies. Each piece was then thread painted and finished with a satin stitch around the edge. And it reminded me so much of sand dollars when I finished it that I cut the little, I guess you could say, slits in satin stitched around those to make it look even more like sand dollars. This piece was juried into SAQA Connections last year and sold at Houston. Next. This is Geode Cache 1. This piece was created for the theme of fractures and fissures, again for my Four Common Corners group. The inspiration was that I had just returned from a driving trip to Sedona, Arizona, where they have a lot of rock shops. You can choose a nondescript looking rock out of a big pile. It looks just like a gray rock on the outside. And you can have the shop open it for you. And inside you have a magical world of crystals. So with that in mind, I drew the inner shapes on paper and paper pieced the quote crystals. And then I added the semicircular outer rings, heavily quilted, and then stitched all the individual pieces together. Next. This is Coral Reef. And again, it is made in the same manner with tie-dyed cotton as the other just a little bit ago. This is also heavily thread painted. That yellow piece in the middle has approximately 180,000 stitches in it. It was just awarded first place at the Evolution Show at the Rocky Mountain Quilt Museum in Golden, Colorado. It's a beautiful show, so if you're in the area, please do stop by and see it. Next. This is X's and O's because what's better than hugs and kisses? This piece was created for the theme of whimsy. The circular pieces that are stamped on the actual circle pieces were created from a piece of styrofoam that I found blowing along the road. So I used that now stamp to stamp those pieces onto that cotton fabric. I then cut the X shape from an eraser and use that to stamp the X's onto the fabric. And again, same method, satin stitched around the edge. I use a 50 weight Hellon heavy duty interfacing, and I've now actually gone to 2 layers of that. And this quilt was really the first departure from something that's entirely circular. Next. Geode Cache 2 was created in the identical manner as Geode Cache 1, which is paper pieced, drawn out. I hadn't planned to make another Geode Cache quilt, but I didn't pay enough attention to some dates. And I entered Geode Cache 1, and it was away when it needed to be someplace else. So what I learned was to pay a lot better attention to dates, and Geode Cache 2 was born. Next. And now we arrive at gastronomy and who broke the yoke. I began working with the theme by looking up the definition of gastronomy, which is in pertinent part the study of the relationship between food and culture, the cooking styles of particular regions, and the science of good eating. I began to think about the foods that are found in most cultures around the world when I happened to have a conversation with my son's girlfriend, who explained that she was trying to perfect making eggs over easy, but she always broke the yolk. So that's where the idea for this piece began. Next. And here you see the back, which shows just a regular hanging sleeve. Sometimes a bit of the sleeve does peek out into the front, but that doesn't bother me too much. And usually it's just a tiny bit. It does take a little bit of extra attention to get the sleeve in the correct position because I don't have that flat edge of a typical quilt to use as a guide. The eggs themselves are pieced as set in circles with the smallest pieces or the yolks being fused. I very much enjoy quilting each individual part and creating them in a distinct and unique manner. Next. So you can see there the quilting and the sort of the dripping of the yoke. I now refer to this series as semi-sculptural quilts, which of course are very different than my more traditional abstract formatted and pieced quilts. It's been an interesting journey, and I'm excited to see what's next. I've just signed a letter of intent with the National Quilt Museum for an exhibition in their corner gallery beginning in May 2023 and running until July 2023. So if you're in that area, you'll be able to see many of these pieces and hopefully a lot more in this series. Again, thank you to SAQA for this presentation.
Thank you, Diana, and congratulations on your exhibition at the National Quilt Museum. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Jeannie, you can turn back on and turn, there you go. So I wanted to start by asking Diana to talk a little bit about where you see the positives and negatives of creating works that are pierced so that they are discrete elements that you're then joining into a whole, and the background or the wall shows through between the different elements. So it may, the one that you started with, the trees, sounds like the wood pile itself may have inspired the format, but you've clearly embraced it and now have quite a body of work all using this same basic format, which is very unusual.
Indeed it is. I did have a friend come over and stood in front of that quilt, and she's a wonderful artist, and she says, I think you need to do a deep dive into this and really explore this method. So I very highly respect her opinion, and I thought, well, I have nothing to lose. So I did move forward with that clearly. And what I enjoy about this is it's like making a traditional block. If you mess it up, you can actually just make another. And I do like the shadows that fall onto the wall. I like how the viewer is engaged in a very different way. And just really watching when folks came into the studio and the residency, and they'd get up very close, and you know, how does she do that?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really exciting because it really truly engages people in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. Have you done any experimentation pushing it farther from the wall so that the shadows are a more bigger element in what people experience?
I haven't, but I do have an idea in mind. So we're going to
Okay.
stay tuned on that.
All right, that sounds great. Jeannie, the big question is about Yupo paper. So somebody asked, what is it? And somebody else said, I've tried working with it and have had disastrous results. So talk about how you use it and where you think it is particularly productive for you.
Well, I love surprises, so that's why I do well with the Yupo. But you can also get a very fine line, but it's something that acrylic paint actually works better than watercolors. I've experimented there, and you have to let it dry, and then you have to go in and take out some, and then you have to maybe spray it with water if you don't like it. So spray it with water, let it dry, and then, or put in more paint. But it's a long process because you have to really dry in between. And you can stamp in it while it's wet or it's not wet. And I just love the surprises, the running with and a lot of times I'll wipe off the whole thing, almost like when my mom used to do oil paintings. I'd go to school and there'd be a painting and I got home and it's white. And I'm like, she goes, I didn't like it. So she covered the whole thing up. So it's almost like that. And so sometimes I come back and wipe the whole thing off, and then it does leave stains. So it actually, you have that little bit of drawing still there. And so, and you can even come in with some pencils. It's just, I love love the process because of the surprises and it's not just trying to look like it. It makes it, you know, the fruit even actually looks juicy when it's painted like that. So.
Mhm. Well, I could see because you're so inspired by your watercolor paintings that working on the Yupa, which is more of a piece of plastic, it's not paper from wood pulp, it's or from fibers, it's plastic, and that's why it does run, and you can wipe it off or scratch it off or play with it. And then when you're transferring from it, how do you do that?
Well, either send it away, the photograph, and have it printed on fabric commercially, or I take a lot of fabric and treat it and put it on the back of paper and run it through my printer. So,
Okay.
and then I treat it again so we don't. So.
Okay. So Joy Hecht, who posted a lot about her experiments, it sounds like you need to go back and do some more experimenting because it does have a lot of interesting potentials. Diana, you talked about a technique called frottage. Would you please explain that a little bit more?
Sure. I believe it's a French term that actually means rubbing. So it would be anything that has a textured surface that you could put in my case, I can only use, you know, speak to fabric. I don't know about paper or anything else, but put a piece of fabric on that textured surface and then just rub I think I used an oil crayon on mine. And you'll get very interesting textures.
Yeah, for those of you who remember as children doing rubbings of coins on a piece of paper with a pencil, it's the same technique, but this is on fabric. And I agree that the people I've seen using it often use something oily or a grease pencil. I know Susan Lenz had a whole series where she would go into cemeteries and do rubbings of old gravestones as her inspiration. I wanted to actually ask you a little bit, I'll do Diana and then Jeannie, about where you most get your inspiration, because in your presentation, you talked about your wood pile. And then you talked about going into a rock store and opening up a geode. And then you talked about picking up a piece of styrofoam, which you used as a stamper. So clearly your surroundings seem to trigger your creativity.
They do. And this series that I have termed Gifts from the Universe is a series that I would like to invite the viewer to really remember that we're part of the universe and all of these amazing gifts are around us that we don't always pay as much of attention to. 18-inch sand dollar or inlay floor, quite a very large blossom. So it's really an invitation to the viewer to remember that we're part of a bigger picture. So I often use nature as a big inspiration.
Unless it's styrofoam.
Yes.
But yeah, and that's wonderful. Jeannie, when you're talking about your work, you also seem to be drawn to nature, although often it's food-based. But you do a lot of paintings, a lot of photographs, it sounds like. How do you decide which pieces you're going to take forward into finished art quilts?
Well, it's a hard one. When I walk my dog every day, that's my inspiration because I'm alone with her. And a lot of the times I'll be at home and I can't figure out how I'm going to do something. Well, when I walk my dog and all of a sudden my mind kind of wanders and I do look around at nature. I mean, we live with wild animals here, so we've, and somehow my mind just turns around, flips around, and I've solved my problem. So I go back to the studio and try that, but then sometimes it doesn't work. So I just have to, kind of think about, I work on about 3 projects at a time. So if I have one I'm stopped at, then I'll go to the next one, and sometimes that'll solve the first one. So.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to me, speaking with artists, that some people are, I need to work on one all the way to the end because otherwise I can't focus. And other artists very much do what you do, which is work on multiple pieces because it helps them when they get stuck to just switch gears. And you tend to be either one type or the other, and to stick to that. Kathleen McLaughlin has asked me to remind everybody that not all graveyards allow you to do rubbings of the old cemetery stones because it can cause damage. So check in case you want to try that out, or just go out into an object that doesn't have those things like Diana's woodpile and do your rubbing there. Diana, I wanted to finish by asking you to talk a little bit about something you mentioned, which is when you're given a prompt, you do a writing exercise. Can you talk a little bit about how that works to get you ideas for what you're going to create?
Sure. Sometimes, like as in gastronomy, just as an example, I'll look up a definition just to sort of round out what my perception is. I will sit down like with Wisdom of Trees and write down about tree rings. And I actually did quite a bit of studying about that, as well as geodes and how geodes were formed, so that I have a better understanding and I know a little bit more about what I am working with and what I'm dealing with. But really it's a word prompt. Like, I don't do sketching. So I guess I am a more a different brain other than, sitting down with a sketchbook. That's just not my style. So I'll sit down with words.
Yeah, and I've also encountered that, is that some artists need to start with words. I've interviewed artists who start with the title and then the piece evolves from the title, and others are much more visually inspired, and so it comes out of the image. Jeannie, are you more of an image person?
Definitely, yeah. Well, I enjoy sketching, and again, like when you get a title and I'm like, okay, I need to think about this gastronomy, and I said, well, how am I going to, so I look through my sketches, and which I do a lot of food sketches, and and then I thought, oh gosh, I've done this painting, I'll do something with that. And then and like I said, I like to add all my different fabrics too with it. So
yeah, there are 2 more process questions for you. What kind of printer do you have that you're using to print your fabric with?
it's a laser and regular laser printer.
Okay.
I treat the fabric well, you can buy all different treatments. That's just, I don't have a favorite, and I have to say I don't know the name of it offhand, but I do treat the fabric first and soak it in a solution and let it dry, and then iron it onto the freezer papers and then run it through the machine.
And then the other one is something that we talked about when we were doing a practice session, and that is that you said that some of the borders for your work are created by transferring dye from old men's silk ties. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's such an easy process, and it's actually a really fun process. That the one I had the really bold stripes and in my Italian picture, and so you just wrap the ties in silk, and I usually do silk organza, and wrap them up and cook them with a little vinegar and water, and it'll transfer to them because you tie them up in a little knot thing. And then when you open it, it's just a surprise that you have, because the silk transfers to silk. And so you can use any kind of silk. And so, yeah, then again, another more surprises. And so then I use that and bits and pieces of that in my work. So.
Okay. Diana, last question, really last question. What are you working on now?
I am starting a very, very large piece that will have 4 panels, and it will be about the seasons.
Seasons. Oh, that sounds nice. And Jeannie, what are you working on right now?
I am getting into my botanical dyeing. And so I'm actually have a dye garden this year. And so I'm doing more of a modern type quilt with all the botanicals.
Okay. What's a for instance of what's growing in your garden?
What's the black-eyed
Susans?
Susans, yes. Those are the only ones that have come up so far. But around in my yard, I have numerous daisies, different kinds of daisies.
Okay.
And, so and I'll walk through the park because I've been collecting flowers in our park. Because if I just rub the leaf, I can see if it's going to transfer dye or not. A lot of them don't. But,
right. Yeah.
So
yeah. No, I ended up breaking the tip of my finger once trying flower pounding, where you pick up the flower and then you hammer it and the dye is supposed to transfer that way. Well, I didn't know that not all flowers would make beautiful prints. So I hammered harder and harder and harder, and ouch. I want to thank you both so much for sharing your work with us today. I want to thank our audience for being here. We are asking that if you can afford to do so, that you donate to support the ongoing costs of Textile Talks at www.saqua.com/TT support. We put it in the chat, so you can just click on and it will go right through. And I want you to stay online so that you can see the full exhibition of gastronomy. It's also on the SAQA website, saqua.com/gastronomy, and it will premiere at the Quilt Festival in Houston at the end of October and early November. And so if you're going down to Houston, you'll have the opportunity to see these beautiful works in person, which is always the best way to see any art quilt. Thank you again for being here, and enjoy gastronomy.
Thank you.